The relationship between Richard III and Edward IV is one of the few issues on which both Richard's accusers and defenders agree. It was of enormous importance and, for the most part, positive. However, the consensus ends here. While Ricardians link Richard's motto, "Loyalty binds me," to his brother, critics have long pointed out that the two certainly had their disputes. This is evident not only in Edward's treaty with France in 1475, which ended the Yorkist war program swiftly, much to Richard's vehement opposition. Another example comes from a document dated June 1st, 1482, in which Richard and his wife, Anne Neville, received a general pardon for offences up to a damage amount of 10,000 marks. No explicit context is provided, but it is thought to be connected to the Scottish campaign occurring at that time, a detail usually mentioned in the records. This example also highlights Richard's significant role as the king's strongman in the north. Ironically, both these sources can be interpreted in two ways. The very existence of pardons suggests something serious had occurred, necessitating such a step. Yet, the fact that Edward granted the pardon underscores their close relationship. Richard's dual nature is already evident in the sources and has been a subject of debate for centuries. As early as 1788, William Hutton wrote, "Richard III of all the English monarchs bears the greatest contrariety of character. Some few have conferred upon him almost angelic excellence, have clouded his errors and blazoned every virtue that could adorn a man. Others, as if only extremes would prevail, present him in the blackest dye. His thoughts were evil, and that continually, and his actions diabolical. The most degraded mind inhabited the most deformed body." Few moments capture this dualistic perception of Richard III as vividly as the scene at Stony Stratford on April 30th, 1483, when Edward V and his uncle, the future Richard III, faced each other. According to Dominic Mancini, the young king realized he was a prisoner, despite the oaths sworn by his father's brother. Richard, of course, had a different view. Numerous testimonies reveal that he believed he had saved both his nephew and the kingdom. Both sides had valid points, and both were wrong. To this day, Richard's critics and defenders struggle to separate themselves from these entrenched interpretations. Yet these perspectives tell us a great deal about Richard, who was still Duke of Gloucester at the time, and they highlight the significance of his relationship with Edward IV. Let's begin with the Richard hostile view of the Stony Stratford events. The Privy Council had proclaimed Edward V as king, in line with Edward IV's will from 1475. The council had also determined that Edward V would govern as an adult, with a council only to advise him. Richard was to serve as its chairman, but this did not grant him real power over the crown's affairs. Nonetheless, Richard had just arrested the king's closest confidants, his uncle Anthony, Earl Rivers, who had acted like a father to him, his half-brother Richard Grey, and his chamberlain Sir Thomas Vaughan, sending them to the north. Essentially, this amounted to kidnapping. Worse still, Edward V did not agree with these actions. According to the council's decision, he was a fully capable adult monarch at that moment. Richard ignored this command from his sovereign, whom he had previously recognized. Regardless of what followed, this was, for the time being, high treason. Even the 12-year-old Edward V understood that his royal authority meant nothing at that moment. Speculating on what might have happened had Edward been crowned is pointless. It was clear to all involved that something irreversible had occurred. Now let's consider Richard's perspective. He believed that something irreversible had already happened, a coup d'etat by the Woodvilles, the Queen's family. Richard, along with his then ally Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, raised this accusation at Stony Stratford. The Ricardians maintain to this day that this was true, and they are right. However, they often struggle to explain it adequately, relying too heavily on Richard's own statements. Richard claimed his life was in danger. Just 4 days later, Richard and Buckingham paraded wagons filled with Woodville weapons through the streets of London. Edward V had previously been guarded by a 2,000-men strong force, largely made up of Woodville troops. These forces were disarmed, and the weapons from the wagons left little doubt about where they had come from. While there may have been those who genuinely wished Richard harm, this argument was also used because it was far more vivid than the constitutional concerns Richard raised as well, especially to a 12-year-old. In essence, the term conspiracy, which Richard is said to have used, is inaccurate. Everything took place in full public view. Edward IV had appointed Richard as Lord Protector on his deathbed to govern until Edward V came of age. The Woodvilles ignored this last will in the Privy Council. They secured a majority in this decision because Richard, a council member, was absent. When it was suggested they wait for Richard, Thomas Grey, Edward V's half-brother, dismissed it, claiming they were important enough to decide without him. The Woodville faction made it clear that not only would they disregard Edward IV's last wish, but they also intended to seize all power. The key figure in this plan was Rivers, Edward V's maternal uncle and closest confidant. It was widely assumed that Edward V would follow the advice of Rivers and his mother. Notably, the council never returned to Edward IV's actual wish, that Richard should serve as Lord Protector until Edward V's majority. It only granted him the protectorship until Edward's coronation. But back to the matter at hand. From Richard's perspective, the situation was as follows. The Woodvilles had ignored Edward IV's dying wish. They controlled the new king, who was legally allowed to govern as an adult. Richard's rights as a council member had been disregarded. Thomas Grey, Edward V's half-brother, was the constable of the Tower of London, giving the Woodvilles control over the capital's most powerful fortress. Elizabeth's brother, Sir Edward Woodville, was appointed admiral by the council, handing them control of part of the army. Crucially, Richard noted that the Woodvilles acted with such speed they didn't wait for the new king's approval, even though they had declared him fully capable of ruling. They made decisions that, under such circumstances, the council was no longer authorized to make. There was a strong chance that Edward V would retroactively approve their actions. But what they had done was still treason. Richard, one of the victims, defended himself. Both sides understood the other's perspective. Richard knew the king would not have contact with his Woodville relatives without implicating him in the Stony Stratford incident. The Woodvilles, for their part, were aware they had crossed multiple lines. The moment they no longer had the king to protect them, they had no choice but to flee. Elizabeth Woodville, her family and Thomas Grey did not retreat to the Westminster Sanctuary out of fear of Richard, but out of fear of their own actions. This episode reveals much about Richard's character. Whether or not one agrees with his judgment, he had a strong sense of right and wrong. He did not shy away from personal risk. It must have been clear to him that the events at Stony Stratford could have dire consequences for him, as evidenced by his later letters to the North requesting troops. Ricardians often overlook the fact that Thomas Vaughan, for example, died simply for being a confidant of Edward V. Richard was convinced of his own importance. He believed his life and the realm were in danger, and that he must save the kingdom from this threat. Reconciliation with the Woodvilles was not an option for him. This conviction ran so deep that a few weeks later the council asked him to show greater respect for Elizabeth Woodville, who was, after all, the Queen Dowager. Historians have long debated whether Richard acted or reacted in the weeks leading up to his ascension to the throne. In my view, this question is misplaced. What truly matters is how Richard's self-perception shaped his actions. The man who stood before Edward V on April 30th, 1483, was a product of his time, moulded largely by his relationship with Edward IV. The prevailing idea of the relationship between Edward IV and Richard III, which remains influential today, was shaped in the 1950s by Paul Murray Kendall. Kendall, an English scholar and one of the leading Ricardians, authored one of the earliest modern biographies of the controversial Yorkist king. In his work, Kendall titles the first chapter, "The King's Brother," portraying Edward as a heroic figure who provided stability during Richard's turbulent childhood. Kendall famously employs the phrase "cradle of violence" to describe their early years. However, Kendall's writing style presents a challenge. His rich, visually compelling language often blurs the line between established facts and speculative interpretations. Kendall romanticizes the York family, using it as a counterpoint to the chaos of the Wars of the Roses. A clear example of this appears in his description of Richard's early experiences at Ludlow Castle in 1459, when Richard, still a child, joined his parents and younger siblings to meet his older brothers, Edward and Edmund, for the first time. Doubtless he often watched in awe as they practiced the manage of axe and sword. It was likely that their father would soon need their stout young arms, Kendall writes. Kendall continues, "Beneath the splendor and excitement of this martial assemblage in the halls of his father, the little boy doubtless felt the tension, lurking in faces and voices, of men confronting a mortal struggle. He would hear harsh words of the Queen, the Frenchwoman who was gathering a host to destroy the House of York." At the age of 7, he was learning that the world was dangerous, even as, gazing at the bright, confident face of his elder brother Edward, he was beginning to sense the valor and pride of the high blood from which he sprang. Kendall's assertions, such as Edward's expressions toward Richard, are plausible but remain speculative. He presents them as fact, and while this may seem a minor issue, it builds over time. Consider another example when Kendall reflects on a period when Richard and his siblings remained in London with Edward, while their mother Cecily travelled to Chester to join their father. It may have been this small domestic idyll which wrought upon Richard one of the master experiences of his life. Edward shone with the blaze of mighty affairs and was the companion of paladins. Yet he took care to watch over his brothers and his sister, regaling them with tales of his adventures, warming them with his affection and his greatness. How could there be anything better than to follow forever and to serve this wonderful brother, so splendid, so kind? Here, Kendall's idealization is clear. He paints Edward as an almost mythical figure and assumes that Richard, just 9 years old at the time, saw him in this heroic light. This is, again, an interpretation. To illustrate, a plausible counter-narrative could suggest that Richard, deeply anxious after the upheavals of recent months, found in Edward a source of comfort. In this scenario, Richard's bond with his eldest brother could have been forged not through admiration of Edward's splendor, but from a profound need for security. While Kendall and I ultimately arrive at the same conclusion, that Edward and Richard shared a special relationship, the underlying context differs significantly. Kendall's narrative revolves around a domestic idyll where Richard is drawn to Edward's greatness. I propose that Richard's bond with Edward was shaped by fear, especially after the violent deaths of their father and second eldest brother Edmund in December 1460. For my Richard, the question of survival, even as a child, must have loomed large, and Edward, as the new head of the family, became a vital source of protection. To further explore Richard's experience, we should also consider how Edward perceived his younger brother's early years. Richard was largely a stranger to Edward during the first 7 years of his life, as Edward grew up with Edmund in Ludlow, while Richard remained with their parents and younger siblings at Fotheringhay Castle. As the youngest child, except for a short time when his baby sister Ursula lived, Richard was the most vulnerable. His parents were frequently absent, leaving his siblings, especially Margaret, whom Kendall suggests acted as a surrogate mother, to care for him. Margaret, though more attached to George, was central to Richard's early care. Edward, however, took responsibility for his younger siblings whenever possible. When he had to flee to Calais with their father, he wrote to the Archbishop of Canterbury, urging him to protect the siblings. The Archbishop took Richard and the others into his household, and Edward continued to make arrangements for their safety even after becoming king. One notable example of Edward's care is when he allowed Richard and George to accompany him to the Tower of London 2 days before his own coronation. This was precisely 22 years to the day before Richard would ascend the throne himself. Edward knighted Richard as a Knight of the Bath and granted him significant titles, such as Duke of Gloucester, Governor of the North, and Constable of Gloucester and Corfe Castles. Over time, Richard became Constable of England and Chief Justice of North Wales. Edward also ensured Richard's training was in the hands of Richard Neville, the Kingmaker. Richard lived for several years with Neville's family at Middleham, where he was safe under the protection of the most powerful man in the kingdom after Edward. Amid the Wars of the Roses, Richard, just 8 years old, was displaced from his home, imprisoned by Lancastrians, forced to flee to Burgundy, and informed of the violent deaths of his father and brother Edmund. Edward clearly recognized this and stepped in to fill the void, perhaps even feeling a sense of guilt, a feeling I suspect, though this is speculative. Acting as a surrogate father, Edward became the stabilizing force in Richard's life. However, this relationship underwent a double rupture in the mid-1460s. First, Richard was sent to live with the Nevilles, creating a physical separation. Second, Edward secretly married Elizabeth Woodville on May 1, 1464, though he publicly introduced her as Queen a few months later. This changed everything. The stability Richard had known began to erode. Edward's marriage alienated not only the Kingmaker, but also their brother George, and it forced Richard to share his once close relationship with a woman he neither knew nor understood. It's also important to acknowledge that Edward had to learn kingship on the job. With no real role model, Henry VI was hardly fit to fill that role. Edward made many mistakes and often acted impulsively, relishing his power. He believed his forgiveness of allies and enemies alike would be appreciated and reciprocated. However, the resistance to his marriage, which ultimately erupted into open conflict, revealed Edward's miscalculations and lack of political foresight. These missteps impacted the entire family. Richard, already burdened by loss, now found himself among people who were loyal to Edward, but deeply hostile to Elizabeth and her family. He reacted to this instability the only way he knew how. To better understand Richard's development, we must consider his second potential surrogate father, the Kingmaker, Richard Neville. The York prince spent his formative years in Neville's household, a period that significantly influenced his education and worldview. Neville had no sons, only 2 daughters, and he entertained the possibility of Richard marrying into his family. Edward IV likely found this idea appealing, as it opened the door for Richard to succeed the Kingmaker, thereby consolidating power. A letter from Neville to John Paston, written during Henry VI's reign, offers a glimpse into what Richard was learning in Neville's household. Beyond martial skills, Richard was taught how a king's brother should communicate with subordinates and navigate the complex relationships among the nobility. The location of a child's education was crucial, as it familiarized them with regional dynamics. When Richard had to choose in the early 1470s between focusing his influence as a local magnate in the north or closer to Wales, he chose the north for precisely these reasons. The kingmaker's defection, along with that of Richard's brother George, dealt a significant blow to Richard. Once again, he lost his home, and this time, the rift even divided his family. All future plans were thrown into uncertainty. For Richard, though, loyalty to Edward was non-negotiable. Edward was not only his eldest brother and surrogate father, but also his king. Under Edward's rule, the Wars of the Roses, a conflict that had deeply scarred Richard's childhood, had come to a halt. Edward's role as a source of stability for Richard mirrored his broader role as a stabilizing force for the kingdom. It's important to remember that Richard was a teenager on the cusp of adulthood during this time of upheaval. The defection of the kingmaker and George threatened this stability. However, I believe Richard never once considered betraying Edward to side with his second surrogate father or his other brother. At one point, Neville and George even held Edward captive, which had a disastrous public impact. Edward's captivity mirrored the fate of Henry VI, whom the Yorkists had once imprisoned in the Tower. Ironically, it was the kingmaker who had originally handed over the Lancastrian king to Edward. Edward's imprisonment likely stirred painful memories for Richard of his own time in captivity. Edward had been the one to restore Richard's sense of security after that traumatic experience, and now Edward himself was in a vulnerable position. But by this time, Richard was no longer a helpless child. He was old enough to defend himself and take action against those who, in his eyes, were responsible for this injustice. Now he could confront his fears head-on. To understand Richard's motivations, actions, and concept of loyalty, this moment is key. He lived in a world where law and justice were often at odds. Frequently, Richard himself had been a victim of actions that were lawful but unjust. However, he had learned that fighting for a just cause could be worthwhile. Richard's loyalty was ultimately to his own sense of justice, regardless of its legality. Those who shared his vision of justice became his allies. Those who didn't became his enemies, no matter who they were. The sole exception to this was Edward. Despite their later differences, Edward remained, in Richard's view, a figure of fairness. I don't believe Richard ever saw his brother as an infallible hero, as Kendall portrays him. This certainly wasn't the case during Edward's second reign. Richard understood that Edward was fallible, but he also recognized his brother's ability to correct his mistakes and reward loyalty. To Richard, that was what made Edward just. Naturally, Richard remained loyal to Edward. He followed him into exile when the kingmaker and George restored Henry VI to the throne, and he reluctantly accepted George's return to favor afterward. Ultimately, George had realigned himself with the right side, helping to repair the damage caused. To Richard, it was fair that George regained his place in the family. However, it wasn't fair that George enjoyed the same high reputation with Edward that Richard did. Richard's commitment to justice also reconciled him with the Woodvilles. Although they had once fought against his father, Richard came to respect their loyalty to Edward. The kingmaker had killed the Queen's father and her brother. The Woodvilles had paid with their blood and fought for the Yorkist cause. They had earned their position. Until 1483, Richard maintained a generally good relationship with the Woodvilles, often helping to resolve disputes. Edward and the Queen reciprocated this loyalty. For instance, when Richard sought to marry Anne Neville, and effectively kidnapped her from George's control, Edward and Elizabeth supported him. They ensured Richard received increasing portions of the Kingmaker's legacy, with Edward mediating the situation on Richard's behalf. Richard's marriage to Anne provides the first clear example of what I mean by golden child. George had previously married Anne's older sister Isabel without Edward's consent, which had enraged the king. It took a long time for Edward to calm down. In contrast, Richard's marriage to Anne, though based on similarly independent actions, received Edward's full support. It's worth noting that Richard required a papal dispensation to marry Anne, but he didn't wait for it and proceeded with the marriage. The papal approval never came, making the marriage legally questionable, but Edward never objected. By contrast, when George sought to marry Mary of Burgundy as his second wife, Edward flatly refused, showing no interest in discussing the matter. This raises the intriguing question of whether Edward opposed George's remarriage in general or had specific concerns about this particular union. What is clear is that George had no significant role in Edward's political plans. Unlike Richard, Edward understood that Richard had a strong sense of justice, and the two brothers shared similar views on the balance between law and justice. When Edward appointed Richard as his strongman in the north, he entrusted him with commissions that addressed crucial issues of justice, recognizing Richard's commitment to fairness. These responsibilities were consistently assigned to Richard for this reason. Several examples of these commissions are shown on the screen. Edward also frequently granted his brother special privileges and licenses, further underscoring his trust in Richard. These grants can be seen in the examples presented. Richard's own understanding of loyalty was equally evident, as his loyal servants were also rewarded. A couple of examples of these rewards are displayed on the screen. However, these preferences occasionally sparked controversy. For instance, Richard was granted guardianship of George Neville, a position he coveted despite it having been promised to someone else. In disputes over property and inheritance, Edward often ruled in his brother's favor, reportedly advising opposing parties to simply give up. When Richard did become involved in legal disputes, Edward ensured that a trusted confidant handled the matter. One such example, shown on the screen, involves Thomas Langton, listed as a Doctor of Decrees, who was Edward IV's personal chaplain and later became a bishop. Langton ruled in Richard's favor, illustrating Richard's understanding of loyalty. Langton was one of the few personal favorites of Edward V we know, but Richard continued to support him after the young king's deposition. In the mid-1470s, Richard became entangled in illegal piracy and nearly instigated a war with Scotland. Edward had to publicly rein him in, yet he ultimately made these problems disappear. Time and again, Edward agreed to unfavorable territorial swaps with Richard. After George's execution, Edward became especially generous to his remaining brother, a topic that has sparked much debate. The prevailing theory is that Edward sought to buy Richard's approval for George's execution. I'm not entirely convinced by this theory. The relationship between Richard and George was strained, as evidenced by one of the Paston letters from 1473, which I display here. It's equally possible that Edward awarded Richard much of George's former property simply because he trusted him and wanted to keep him close. Richard played no role in George's execution and wasn't present, suggesting that he may have found the decision too extreme. However, there is no concrete evidence to support this theory. When war with Scotland finally broke out, Richard was given command without hesitation. Some historians, like Michael Hicks, have pointed out that other candidates with more military experience than Richard were available, yet Edward still chose him. While Richard was celebrated for recapturing Berwick Castle, the success had more to do with internal Scottish strife and English support for Alexander, Duke of Albany, as a potential claimant to the Scottish throne. Richard faced little resistance, and his army achieved limited gains. Edward was reportedly appalled by the war's cost, £100,000, a sum disproportionate to the outcome. Despite this, Edward portrayed Richard as a hero, which reflected the larger role Richard played for England, a topic we will discuss in greater depth next week. It's worth noting that Hicks, in his book on Richard, downplays his loyalty to Edward by pointing out how well Richard was compensated for his services. While I don't entirely dismiss this argument, it's important to remember that Richard incurred significant expenses while carrying out assignments for the crown, and it wasn't unusual for him to pass these costs on to Edward. What was unusual in this case is that the king actually paid. The key takeaway is that Edward granted Richard considerable freedom and privileges, which Richard took full advantage of. Yet, as far as we know, Richard never crossed the line by explicitly tying his loyalty to specific rewards. He felt a responsibility to his lands and his subordinates, which sometimes led to conflicts. Richard undoubtedly tested the limits of the freedoms Edward granted him, but their relationship remained intact. The controversy surrounding Richard did not arise during Edward's lifetime, but after Edward's death. With Edward's death, the key mediator between Richard and the Woodville family was lost. Simultaneously, the Queen's family lost their protector within the high nobility, which was largely hostile towards them. Critics who question Richard's closeness to Edward IV often point to his treatment of Edward's family and those close to him after the king's death. At first glance, this argument seems convincing. Richard dismantled the Queen's family. Anthony Woodville and Richard Grey were executed on his orders, as was Vaughan. The Queen and her daughters were forced to seek asylum in a church, losing their property and inheritance. As long as Richard lived, they were deemed illegitimate. Even Edward's closest ally, William Hastings, was executed by Richard, and his lover, Jane Shore, was disgraced. The fate of the princes in the Tower has been the subject of much speculation, as we have explored on this channel. What is certain is that their situation did not improve after Edward IV's death. However, upon closer inspection, the claim that Richard destroyed everyone and everything dear to Edward begins to unravel. For instance, Richard Woodville, the Queen's younger brother, was permitted to retain the title of Earl Rivers. Though Richard III took control of his estates, he otherwise left him unharmed. Earl Rivers even participated in the Buckingham Rebellion, but was later pardoned by Richard. Thomas Grey, the Queen's son, was reportedly so tempted by Richard III that he considered abandoning Henry VII during his exile. Although this failed and resulted in Thomas's imprisonment in Paris, it shows that at one point he preferred life under Richard. It's surprising how few Ricardians cite this example to argue that Richard could not have been responsible for the murder of the princes in the Tower. It's also important to note that Cecily Neville, Richard's mother, lived peacefully under his rule, as did George's children. Jane Shore, while imprisoned briefly under Richard, later married Thomas Linham under dramatic circumstances and lived until 1527. Richard demanded only a public penance from her, likely for harboring Thomas Grey during his escape from England, even though he had ample pretext to kill her. She was largely left undisturbed under Richard's reign, despite a letter from Richard opposing her marriage plans. Some Ricardians might even argue that Richard did not destroy the Woodville family entirely. He reconciled with the former Queen and brought Elizabeth of York to court, although their political influence had diminished. The Woodvilles went from being a powerful political force to being dependent on Richard. How can all this be explained? I believe it returns to Richard's sense of justice and his determination never to be a victim again, ensuring he could protect himself if necessary. Historical sources suggest the Queen was surprised that Edward made Richard Lord Protector, but I doubt it. The plan seemed premeditated. Edward had clearly prepared Richard for the role. In a sense, Richard had long served as protector of the kingdom, defending the volatile Scottish border and holding a seat on the Council of Wales and the Marches, which was responsible for educating Edward V in governance. A 1479 document even shows the Crown Prince's name alongside Richard's and the Archbishop of Canterbury's. Edward IV's hopes were evident. Richard was meant to play the same role for Edward V that he had for Richard, protecting and guiding him in governance. Richard was, at the time, the only person in the kingdom with sufficient experience in governance. Evidence from the first month of Richard's protectorship shows that young Edward V's signature appeared on documents. Richard did not initially exclude him. So why did this arrangement fail? It brings us back to Stony Stratford. Richard broke the law to enforce what he perceived as justice. Without Edward IV as a moderating force, Richard's unchecked aggression became evident. He was not a man of peace, nor did he shy away from violence. He had known no other way. Kendall's words, "cradle of violence," resonate here. When Richard felt unfairly treated or threatened, he reacted forcefully. Could Richard have ordered the murder of the princes in the Tower? I believe, though this may be controversial, that such a scenario is certainly conceivable. If Richard believed that the boys' deaths would serve the greater good by preventing further suffering, he might have deemed it the just course of action. In my opinion, the only person who could have stopped him was Edward IV. William Hastings died simply because Richard felt threatened and thought his death would serve the larger picture. Does this mean Richard is definitively responsible for the deaths of the princes? No, of course not. In conclusion, Edward IV and Richard III were deeply interdependent, likely more than either of them realized. Edward's reign was incomplete without Richard, and Richard's brief rule demonstrated that he could not function effectively without Edward. Richard's failure to build a lasting coalition strong enough to sustain his reign is evidence of this. While we will never know what kind of king Edward V might have been, we do know that Richard III aspired to be a just king. However, his success would have required the stabilizing presence of his brother. As always, I welcome comments and opinions of any kind, as long as they are respectful. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe to support the channel.